So, I want to thank you for tuning in for another lecture. Here we are. I'm going to switch things up. Now, if you've been following the channel and if you've been taking the time to subscribe, if you haven't, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to like videos. Check out some of my other videos. Just giving a little bit of introduction on what this channel is going to be about, looking at victimology from a personal perspective. And then the very first lecture that I ever uploaded dealt with the mafia, from Capone to the Teflon Don with Love, parts 1 and 2. So be sure to check those videos out. But I thought I would switch things up a little bit. And one of the classes that I'm currently lecturing on is homicide. And listen, who doesn't love to talk about homicide and serial killers? And I thought it would be so fitting to have my first lecture on homicide. Even though I've been teaching this topic now for several months, I thought it would be very fascinating, very fitting to have this first lecture on homicide deal with none other than serial killers. Now, I really wish you could be on this journey that I have my students on, where my syllabus has some of the most unique topics. It keeps the students guessing because they don't know what I'm going to talk about. And this is one of the reasons why for that class, I cannot stress enough the importance of attendance. So with this coming, and with us getting to the end of the semester rather, obviously I'm not going to release all of my homicide lectures. Can't do that. But having said that, I'm going to whet your appetite a little bit over the next week or two, or maybe 3, with a few of my select homicide lectures. And you'll get them almost in real time. So this was the topic that I had last week. So you're literally getting what I just lectured on. Once again, if you have not subscribed, please be sure to subscribe. So that way, anytime I upload and post a new lecture, you will be able to follow it. So this topic, psycho killer, let's jump right in. So within this lecture, I'm going to look at the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath. We want to kind of understand how these two are separated. Then we want to identify and define modus operandi. What does that mean? You may have heard that whenever you watch a movie dealing with a serial killer or a psychopath, or even some horror films. You may have heard the modus operandi, as well as the signature and how they fit within serial killer lore. Then we want to examine the definition of a serial killer. How do we define a serial killer? What about the origins of the term and any potential concerns with timing? We'll look at 2 categorical types of serial killers based on the method of operation. Then we're going to discuss serial killer subtypes and look at examples of infamous serial killers and how they were defined. And last but not least, we will review potential categorizations and how it meets the definition of serial killers. Now, I will preface this lecture by saying this will be probably one of the few lectures where I will do one whole lecture. Normally, I break it down because I want to treat all of my viewers, all of you who are coming on this journey, who are saying, you know what? This guy is the professor for the people. He's talking about criminal justice topics from a very unique perspective, and we like how he's lecturing on this. So with that being said, normally you would get this in a 2-parter, but what I'm choosing to do is do one full lecture with everything, and then moving forward, any other topic, generally speaking, will be broken into 2 parts. So what I want you to think about as you're watching this lecture, wherever you are, you could be in Florida, you might be in New York, you could be in Texas or California, or somewhere around the world. But you clicked on this video and you want to sit down and you want to hear from a professor, hear from someone who has a background in criminal justice, and you want to ask yourself, why am I fascinated with serial killers? What is it about serial killers that makes me want to learn more? What is it about serial killers that whets our appetite? Because you're watching this lecture, you've undoubtedly seen a true crime podcast, or seen a true crime video, or heard a true crime podcast, or watched a true crime podcast. But there is a distinct fascination with serial killers that exists not just in our country, but around the world. And so, what I want you to think about as I go through this lecture is, what are some of the reasons why serial killers do what they do? Why do they off somebody? Why do they take lives? What is it? And what are your thoughts on it? And I hope that as you're thinking about it as we go along, hopefully you will find yourself having these questions answered. So, serial killers, they're not sexually motivated, at least not most of them, right? In my research, and I've taught on a number of classes. So if you're like, well, I'm just seeing this lecture for the first time. I didn't see your intro lecture, and I didn't see your little brief talk on victimology, and I didn't see the gangs one. But this is the first lecture I'm ever hearing from you. I've taught on a variety of topics, and what is noteworthy is that in doing my research for this class, Homicide, everything's built from the ground up. I have to do a lot of independent research when I put these lectures together, and it takes a lot of work. Serial killers are not sexually motivated. In other words, we often think, and we may even see this in the media, that the serial killer assaulted this person, or the serial killer, victimized this individual in this way. What we do know is that serial killers kill for any number of reasons. They might kill for anger. They might kill for the thrill of it. They may kill for a financial gain, or they want to seek attention, or they might do it just for pure fun. For some of these serial killers, it is fun. Think about what is fun to you. Maybe reading a book, maybe going to the movies, maybe riding a bike. For me, I love riding my electric scooter. I love nature. I love taking walks. But we all have something that's fun. And for serial killers, their fun is not what we would define as fun. In fact, that's going to be a great segue into us talking about psychopaths and sociopaths in a moment. So serial killers do tend to murder for sport. Now, one of the things I want you to understand is that there's absolutely a great diversity in the needs and desires of serial killers. So you can just right now probably name any number of serial killers. There's some of the most infamous ones: John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Aileen Wuornos, Richard Ramirez. And then there's obviously ones that maybe didn't get the same level of notoriety. For example, Wayne Williams. Some people are like, yeah, did Wayne Williams really do what he did? And if you don't know who Wayne Williams is, go look him up. With that being said, because there is a great diversity in the needs and desires of serial killers, what you have to understand is that the serial killer's mind, their mind is not like our mind. See, serial killers typically have some trait that separates them from the rest of the public. Although there are some serial killers, and some that we will discuss in this lecture, that you will say, wow, that's almost stunning to me that this could have been the neighbor next door. This could have been a man that I dated. This could have been a friend of mine. And so what I want to say is that if you want to get into the minds of a serial killer, if you want to understand how their mind operates very differently from our mind, the best way to do that, the best way to get into their head, is to simply talk to them. Find out what truly motivates them. Find out why they respond and why they act the way they act. So there's a number of videos out there. You can look at videos right here on YouTube. You can find a number of videos of individuals interviewing serial killers. And by the way, let me preface, and one thing about me, I love to add pop culture to my lectures. I love to do current events, and I love history. I am a history buff through and through. We know, or we may have seen movies that depict what a serial killer is, aka The Silence of the Lambs, and looking at Hannibal Lecter. But you're not going to have every serial killer that's going to be a cannibal. We're just not. Having said that, it's important for us to understand psychopathic / antisocial personality. What does this mean? And we have to have this discussion because it does help us get into their mind a little bit on why they act and how they act. So when we're looking at psychopathic and antisocial personality, we see that it's a combination of traits and an inability to empathize with others that makes the person prone to deviant behavior and violence. Now, when we're talking about murder, we know and see that this can be categorized as either someone who has sociopathic tendencies or someone who has psychopathic tendencies. Let's start with the sociopath. This is a person with a personality disorder manifesting itself in extreme antisocial attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. The way I describe a sociopath to my students and a number of different classes when I've lectured on this topic, the sociopath, they have beliefs that may not necessarily be in lockstep with the rest of society. Let me give you a great example. We know that there's a very controversial measure out there when it deals with women and whether they can be pro-life or pro-choice. And I'll keep it that way to keep it very clean. If you are pro-life or you're pro-choice, that is your choice, okay? You make that decision, right? However, a sociopath can say, I'm very pro-life, and I'm very frustrated that this clinic that is pro-choice is opening up in my neighborhood, and I'm going to do something about it. And maybe that person who could be a devout father, a devout employee, they could be an outstanding and upstanding citizen with not a blemish on their record. They say, I am mad at what they're doing at that clinic, and so I'm going to go to that clinic and I'm going to take matters into my own hands. That's a sociopath. They still committed murder, but they're a sociopath because their argument is that you being pro-choice is contrary to me being pro-life, and because you're pro-choice, I got to do something about it. I have to take a stand. Sociopath, through and through. Now, the alternative to that is the psychopath. And the psychopath is someone who suffers from a chronic mental disorder. They have abnormal or violent social behavior. They don't have a conscience. And their concern really is about themselves, right? In fact, it's very narcissistic. Psychopaths are very narcissistic. They're all about themselves. They're all about me. They don't have a concern regarding the well-being of others. And what I want you to think about is serial killers, which is why this lecture is called Psycho Killer, because it's examining serial killers within the realm of homicide, which is the overarching class that I have. And just to recap, since we are doing this channel relatively later in the semester, murder is defined as the unlawful killing of one human being by another. So it's taking someone's life unlawfully. The psychopath is a serial killer. They absolutely are committing murder because they don't have a conscience. They don't have a concern. They are very violent. And because of their violence and because something mentally is off with them, this is one of the reasons why they are labeled as the psychopath. So one of the easiest ways to remember it, again, why I say a pop culture reference, the man you see on the left of your screen is the Joker. This Joker, this itineration of the Joker was played by none other than the late, great Heath Ledger. I'm going to tell you something. The Dark Knight, very, very good movie. Matter of fact, you see, I got movie posters behind me. I'm in my theater room, and I was like, I should have grabbed The Dark Knight and held it up for you because I have it on my shelf. But Heath Ledger's The Joker was the definition of a psychopath through and through. Again, if you have never seen The Dark Knight and if you are a Batman fan, I would highly recommend you go check it out. Quick pop culture reference. The man on the right is none other than Benedict Cumberbatch. Now, you might know him as Doctor Strange. I am a Marvel junkie through and through. I have some Marvel posters around my theater room. Benedict Cumberbatch, he plays Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes is the epitome of a sociopath because what does Sherlock Holmes do? He solves crimes that no law enforcement officer, no member of Scotland Yard can solve. And he has unconventional methods in solving those crimes, breaking into homes, stealing stuff, withholding evidence, maybe even pulverizing the bad guy. But he is the definition of a sociopath because his argument is, hey, I'm getting the bad guy. You don't like how I'm getting the bad guy, but I'm getting the bad guy. So that's the difference, folks. The psychopath, someone like the Joker, no conscience, very, very cold, very, very manipulative, but calculating. And then the sociopath, someone who is maybe very intelligent, but they may have an extreme antisocial belief or attitude to get their man, like Sherlock Holmes, even though they are breaking the law. So now that we got the psychopath and the sociopath out the way, let's first talk about the modus operandi. And you may have heard this, you may have seen it in some shows or movies, but the modus operandi is basically the perpetrator's method of operation, and this is their MO. So you'll hear this in podcasts, or if you watch podcasts or watch videos, you might hear someone say, "Oh, the MO." And if you've never heard of it, you may say, "Well, what does MO mean?" Other than it being two initials. No. It's the method of operation. It's the way that they do things as it relates to murder, of course. And so the MO is typically going to include a couple of things. First of all, it's going to include the victim type, the fact that they may be going after a blonde or a brunette. They may be looking at someone who is black or white. Then it can also include the location. For example, like the bars, whether they go to a secluded location, whether they are looking at college campuses. And since this is a class on a college campus, recognize that college campuses can be very dangerous places. What about the weapon that they use? Whether or not their weapon is, a knife, whether it is a rope or some other weapon. They may have something, maybe they use a pipe or a club, but what weapon do they use to take out their victim? Also, what is the method as well? Are they looking at strangulation? Are they looking at stabbing, shooting, bludgeoning, using their bare hands to choke the person? They typically have a method as well. And then lastly, sometimes they may do what's called a ruse or have a technique to lure and abduct the victim. Let me give you a wonderful example. Ted Bundy would pretend that his arm was broken and then ask single women to help him with various tasks. Once he gets to their car, or he gets to his car rather, slips his arm out the sling, overpowers them, you're done. It's some ruse. Hey, I'm a blind guy. Can you help me, right? And then you get help, and then, no, I'm not blind. So it's one of those things where the modus operandi, or the method of operation, is simply put how they do things. And typically with the serial killer, the psychopath, they have the same modus operandi. Now, one thing that is of great importance is the signature. And so the signature are those acts committed that are not necessary to complete the offense, and whose presence often suggests an offender's psychological or emotional needs. Think about the calling card. So if we go back to the Joker, right? Let's bring this back to pop culture. The Joker, he shows up at a scene. He commits any number of crimes. He leaves his calling card. What is the Joker's calling card? A Joker card. And boy, I'm going to have to start doing props. So forgive me, because I'm like, I could have grabbed a Joker card. I could have had the Dark Knight. I will definitely have to use props too for the engagement. But that is his calling card, And so the signature is when we look at, okay, what gives us an indicator that the perpetrator was here? What gives us an indicator that this is our suspect? This is what we, in the FBI lore, will call the unsub. And we'll talk about the FBI in just a moment. The signature varies because it will give us an additional information or clues about the perpetrator, but they can evolve as they become more confident in their behaviors. So you see right here this pentagram, right? What does that pentagram mean? Well, see, Richard Ramirez, who was also known as the Night Stalker, he would leave signatures at crime scenes, and he would have drawings of a pentagram. And so while he was violating or assaulting some of his female victims, he would make them swear an oath to the devil, and it would be a constant reminder that he was the one who was there. The Night Stalker was there. And we'll talk about the Night Stalker towards the end of this lecture. So the signature is just nothing more than the psychopath or serial killer, their calling card. It's an indicator that they were the ones responsible for the crime that was committed. So I told you I was going to talk about the FBI, right? The FBI gives a formal description of what constitutes a serial killer. And this formal description by the FBI has changed over the years. But what I want you to know, and this part is important because you all are going to get a second part, almost a kind of like a sequel to this psycho killer lecture. So stay tuned. You all will, in the next video that will drop in the homicide sequence, so to speak, because right now I'm lecturing on homicide, I'm lecturing on gangs, and I'm lecturing on victimology. So in the homicide sequence, you're going to get another video, and it's almost a direct sequel to this lecture. So stay tuned. But what I'm saying is so important, and you will see this in the next video, or in the next lecture, rather. The definition of a serial killer is a law enforcement label, right? It's a law enforcement term, and it was originated by the FBI. So it's not used for clinical or diagnostic purposes. So it's very important to know that you won't have a psychologist or a psychiatrist or anyone in the mental health field saying that this individual is a serial killer and we're clinically diagnosing them as such. You won't do that. But stay tuned, because in my next class, I'm going to give you kind of, maybe what they will say. So again, nice little segue into my next topic. Having said that, because we know the FBI has designated and they've diagnosed what a serial killer is, I want to give you some criteria that will shape what a serial killer is and how they're defined. Typically, you're going to have one or more killers. It's very possible to have two killers also work in tandem as serial killers. We don't typically see that, though, and there's not a whole lot of evidence out there. There are some, spree killers, so to speak. Can we argue that they're serial killers? Sure, but generally speaking, they will fit the definition of what's called a spree killer, and that's for a whole different class on a whole different day. Two or more murdered victims, at least two incidents occurring in a separate events at different times. So you're not going to have it be multiple victims in one incident location. And generally speaking, it's two separate events at different times. So they're completely separate from each other. There's going to be a period between murders, and this is going to, again, differentiate the serial killer from the mass murderer. Again, that's something that I'll cover in class in a few weeks. For you all, you might get that, but stay tuned. We'll see. And then think about this cooling off period. Generally speaking, the cooling off period can be any length of time, but the bonus point is that the murder takes place over more than a month. And so that leads us to the definition, which is called serial murder. And serial murder is the unlawful killing of two or more victims by the same offender in separate events. That's why we get the definition serial killer. The serial killer is an individual who's going to act in a period of time. If you had an individual that was committing their acts of violence and murder over, a couple of nights, we can't define them as a serial killer. That's a whole different topic. But if they have that cooling off period, which you'll see when we get to some of the more specific types of serial killers, if they have this cooling off period, well, that fits the definition perfectly. And that's why we have this definition of serial murder. So the FBI does categorize serial killers as two types. Think about the first type. The first type is the organized serial killer. This is the individual that's going to plan in advance. They're going to take precautions not to leave evidence behind. They are very intelligent and very meticulous with their work. Now, it is very common for them to stalk victims, right? So the organized serial killer, they might see someone, but they're going to maybe scope them out. They're going to see what their patterns are, how often they come here. Do they take a run in the same location? Do they walk down the street pretty regularly, etc.? Do they go to this park? So they will stalk victims. Social skills are to a T. Very much a smooth talker. Now, I joked with my students and I said to them, I hate to say it, but I'm pretty much a smooth talker. So I would be someone that if I wasn't in the career of law enforcement and if I wasn't, who I am, I would be someone that could fit a serial killer profile because I'm a smooth talker. I talk for a living. They may transport victims to a secondary location. In other words, they'll commit the crime in one place and then they'll take them to another place. And then they might even reach out to the police. In other words, they want people to know who they are, but they want people to give them credit for their work. In fact, they'll do what's called taunting tactics. And, I asked the class, did anybody ever hear about the Zodiac killer? Zodiac was a prime example of this, reaching out to the police, reaching out to the media, getting involved because they want people to know who they are, but they're so intelligent and they do a very good job to cover their tracks. So that's the organized type of serial killer. Now, not to be undone by the organized type of serial killer is the disorganized type. This is one, and this is a serial killer who doesn't plan, so they rarely plan out their victim or their victim's demise. They appear very opportunistic. In fact, they strike when the prospect presents itself. Imagine the disorganized serial killer is at a park. There's an infamous case that I will be sharing with my students tomorrow. So obviously when you hear this, it'll be, the next day. But either way, while the individual was not a serial killer, the individual was so opportunistic. Unfortunately, the victim was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And as a criminologist, as someone who has worked in law enforcement, as someone who has been deeply immersed in the criminal justice system for so long, the case really grieved me. And I will talk to my students about this in victimology because the young lady, she was just literally in the wrong place at the wrong time when her murderer attacked and took her life tragically. So that's a disorganized serial killer. They don't think about it. They just take full advantage of a situation as it presents itself. They don't really cover their tracks. They're very, very sloppy, not organized. They don't try to hide it. They're going to leave evidence behind, very evident. They will move frequently to avoid detection. Again, the individual that I'm talking about, and I wish I could talk about it in this forum, but hey, some of you may put it in the comments. Hey, Professor, what were you talking about? Who was this person? What was this case? And I'd love to share, and you might even see it in a future lecture down the road. But with that being said, they do move around a lot. They will engage in abduction. So instead of luring someone like the Ted Bundy did, having a ruse, they will abduct the person and then, take them away and, end them. And then they don't have a whole lot of recollection of their deeds after the fact because they're so unorganized. They're so opportunistic. They don't even remember what they did or how they got to that particular place. So if we have two key categorical types of serial killers, the organized and the unorganized, I think we can pause and we can look at what are some serial killer subtypes and what are some examples of some of these subtypes. Because, see, we know that the motivations behind serial killers vary, right? Some do it for pleasure. Some do it for sport. Some do it for sexual gratification. Some do it just because. And we know that the FBI has defined serial killers, that cooling off period, 2 or more victims. The FBI has really defined who they are, and it's not a clinical definition, right? It's not a mental health definition. But what I do want to shift gears and look at is that there are certain types of, or certain subtypes of serial killers, and I want to discuss some of these subtypes and examples of serial killers that you may or may not have heard of. So let's get right into it, shall we? The first angry subtype is The first serial killer subtype, rather, is the angry subtype. And the angry subtype is a serial killer who has a motivation displaying rage or hostility towards a certain subgroup of the population. Now, the reason why I'm picking Aileen Wuornos here, folks, is because Aileen Wuornos had a palpable rage towards men. Why did she have it? Because she was victimized by men, right? Men were purchasing and soliciting her for services, those types of services, and she took them out. Even though she was in Florida, and even though that's kind of what she did, she just took them out. She robbed them, and she executed them. The angry subtype of serial killer has this level of anger and rage, and oftentimes this level of anger and rage shows up in something called overkill. In fact, overkill gives us a very key clue, and it is very present, where they may leave degrading messages, or they may just do more than what was necessary in order to take out the victim. So let's talk about this overkill for a moment, right? What is overkill? So overkill is a factor sometimes found in murders that involve using excessive force against the victim. In fact, this excessive force, it's not even, there's no need for it, right? So excessive force can be numerous stab wounds, and the stab wounds are post-mortem. Post-mortem means after death, or extreme bludgeoning. In a different class, in a different period of time, I showed an example of an individual that was bludgeoned so badly, his whole face and his cranium was indented in. It's almost like it was just hit and hit and hit and hit to where it was just indented in. That's extreme. That is extreme. It's overkill. It's the definition of overkill. It's more than excessive force. Think about multiple gunshot wounds. Again, more than needed to kill or subdue, and even issuing a severe beating. So overkill gives two things. Sorry, I went a little quickly. Overkill gives us one of two things about the offender. One, that there had to be a personal relationship of some type between the victim and the perpetrator. And then the second one was there's a general uncontrolled anger that got out of control during the attack on the victim. Now I can go to this. So a couple of weeks ago, I gave a lecture, or a few months ago, rather. It was titled Murder Was the Case. And you can kind of maybe gauge what I was talking about. But either way, this is Jodi Arias. Some of you can look up videos on Jodi Arias. There's a lot of videos out here on YouTube and in social media talking about her. You know what Jodi Arias did to the gentleman you see right here that's dressed in the clean suit? She did take him out. But when she offed him, she did it excessively. 27 stabs, slit throat, shot. I mean, pictures of him bleeding profusely. Deranged and psychotic. That was overkill. This poor individual that passed away, he probably would have died, or passed away rather, after a few stabs. But Jodi Arias went above and beyond. Hatred and rage. That's overkill. And that's what Aileen Wuornos exhibited. Maybe not so much overkill, but she definitely fit the category of the angry subtype. So that's our first one. Let's talk about our second one, the ideological subtype. This is the serial killer who possesses a motivation to kill, to elevate the goals or ideas of a specific person or group. Oftentimes, the ideological subtype can be a terrorist group. It can be a significant ideological group. Think about some hate groups that might exist out there. Again, a couple of months ago, I had a lecture called A Time to Kill. And so if you had members of an ideological group that espouses hate or espouses beliefs that are not consistent with most of the country, right? Well, if they were targeting people of a specific race or ethnicity or even a gender, this would be an ideological subtype, because clearly they're sending a message that you are not someone I am in favor of because you're this color, or you're not someone I'm in favor of because you are this gender. That is the ideological subtype serial killer. Then we have the power controlling subtype. The power controlling subtype is one who's motivated by joy they get from a victim's fear and suffering. See, if there's one thing, class, that I can tell you that is going to be pretty consistent when it comes to most serial killers, is that a lot of times they take great pride in knowing that they can instill fear. And some of the serial killers that we'll still get to just in a little bit, they easily fit the power controlling subtype. But Ted Bundy, he fit it from a very different and unique perspective. Typically, they're very organized. They may have had an abusive childhood. And in having that abusive childhood, they might feel weak or inadequate. But when looking at this type of serial killer, it is very, very common for them to engage in other dangerous behaviors, other grave behaviors, but they're not driven by those behaviors. So the reason why Ted Bundy is a great example, because Ted Bundy, he may have had easily 30 plus victims. Unfortunately, there's no real way to know the extent of how many victims Ted Bundy had. But as you see this picture, some of you in here who may have never heard of Ted Bundy may look and say, that guy looks like a charming guy. That guy doesn't look like he'd be that threatening. And let me tell you something. Ted Bundy was arguably one of the most dangerous, the most chilling, the most calculated and cold serial killers out there, because he was a very good stalker. In fact, Ted Bundy was going to be a lawyer. Could you imagine if you're someone that's, in this channel, criminal justice college as I'm calling it, and you say, well, you know what, I do want to hear from a lawyer. I want to go research and see what lawyers might be on YouTube. You could have had someone like a Ted Bundy who was that intelligent, that well-versed in the law, and yet he was a serial killer. He was a power-controlling subtype with 30 plus women victims in Florida and Utah and Washington. Dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. This is the most dangerous type. Very dangerous, because they could literally be the one that is walking right among you. The thrill-seeking subtype, this also goes back to the organized type of serial killer, because the thrill-seeking subtype, this is the serial killer that's motivated by outsmarting the law and engaging in murder as amusement. So for them, they're doing this for fun. It's for nothing more than a sport. Some of you in here may have played hockey, or you may have played football or basketball, or you may have done other athletic events. You did it because it was a sport. It was, engaging, and it was, you had to display some level of athleticism. Well, think about the thrill-seeking subtype. This is the serial killer who literally is trying to outsmart the law, and engaging in murder is for fun. It's amusing. It is something they're doing because they love it. And it gets them a thrill, a kick, an adrenaline rush. So, yes, they do enjoy the attention from the media. They do enjoy having the public live in fear. And in feeding that ego and in stroking their fear, so to speak, as well as the thrills that they're getting by this, they might even send messages to others, or messages to the media, or messages to law enforcement to keep them abreast on what they're doing, but also because they know that they're so smart, it's going to be difficult to catch them. Now, they will get caught eventually. And this is one of the reasons why they sometimes fall in the disorganized category, because number one, they can be opportunistic at times. Number two, they may not plan as much as they maybe started off doing. But number three, eventually their arrogance gets the better of them. And that's why you see right here, Dennis Rader, aka BTK. This man, I'm telling you, BTK is got to be one of the most fascinating serial killers. And there is a course out there called Serial Killers at different colleges and universities. If I ever lecture on serial killers, we're probably going to talk about Dennis Rader for at least a week. Dennis Rader, he went radio silent for 20 some odd years. Again, he had a number of victims that he bound them, he tortured them, and of course he would kill them. And then he goes radio silent. And then out of nowhere, in the 2000s, BTK is back in Wichita, Kansas. Like the people of Kansas had to be like, this guy disappeared off the face of the planet. Maybe we thought he perished, and now he's back. And he's saying, I take credit for this. And oh, by the way, whatever happened over here, that was me. After all of these years, he had a itch. He had a thrill that he wanted to seek out because he went silent for a couple of decades and decided it was time to come out of retirement. That is a thrill-seeking subtype through and through. And if you've never seen anything about Dennis Rader, I challenge you to go look up BTK, who he is and how he was caught. And how he was caught was absolutely mind-blowing. You have got to see it. Now we have the psychotic subtype. And the psychotic subtype, this is one who is motivated by a severe mental illness. They may have auditory hallucinations that may tell them to kill. But if the mental illness is unchecked, then, then they're going to kill. The second they get the mental illness under control, rather, they won't act on those hallucinations and whatnot. And so Ed Gein was diagnosed as a schizophrenic once he was admitted to the Mendota Hospital for the Criminally Insane. Once they got him on his medications, not only was he not violent, but he was very polite and he was considered a model patient. And like I said, I'm going to release kind of the sequel to this lecture, so you're going to get that in the very soon. You might even get it in another day or two. But when I gave this lecture last week, I was like, we're going to come back to Gein. So I'm giving the students back then a sneak peek, and you're getting a sneak peek. We're going to come back to Gein because he's a very fascinating fella as well. But this was the psychotic subtype. Again, severe mental illness, and as long as it's unchecked, they're going to kill. The second that the mental illness is checked, then they don't have any reason to kill. We also have the sexually based subtype. And the sexually based subtype is a serial killer that has a motivation driven by sexual needs or desires. This was also a serial killer that many people should be concerned about, simply because the sexually based subtype, they see that their needs or their desires, their sexual wants and advances are not being met. And so therefore, for them, they may take a life, and in the course of taking a life, they may find sexual fulfillment in doing so, as well as in doing so with the person and the victim. In fact, if any of you in here has ever heard of necrophilia, I don't need to say anything more about necrophilia. But the sexually based subtype, Dennis Nilsen was one. Another sexually based subtype serial killer that I could use, and I may use in the future, was Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer, I would consider a sexually based subtype as well. Although Jeffrey Dahmer had some other things going on, but he absolutely had he was a sexually based subtype. John Wayne Gacy would also fit that subtype as well. And again, those are two serial killers that you can look up. There's plenty of documentaries, videos, podcasts, and more talking about those individuals. And then we have our last one. The visionary subtype. The visionary subtype of serial killer, they also have psychotic breaks. Now, not to be confused with the psychotic subtype. The psychotic subtype is just mad. Remember what I said, and this is why I gave you the definition, and that's what I do as a professor. I like to break things down, and I like to draw back to your remembrance something I may have said earlier. When we're looking at a psychopath, what does a psychopath suffer from? It's chronic and severe abnormal psychological trait that shows that they have no conscience and they have no regard for human life, right? That's the psychopath. The psychotic serial killer, or the psychotic subtype rather, has a mental illness that if it's unchecked, if it's not addressed, then they're going to murder. When it is addressed and they're on their medications and they're receiving mental health treatment, nothing's going on. The visionary subtype may have some mental illness and may have a psychotic break. However, what separates the visionary from the psychotic is the visionary has something that's commanding them to kill. Something is commanding them to take lives. So, for example, they may be told by either a higher power, a supernatural being, the devil, some supernatural being that may be telling them to go ahead and take people out. And they're following it, even though we would look and say that person is absolutely insane. But to them, they're like, no, I'm getting a vision and I'm going to follow that vision. So, one example, David Berkowitz, aka the son of Sam. Demon was allegedly speaking to him through a neighbor's dog, and that's why he went out and terrorized people of New York City. And believe it or not, David Berkowitz is still alive. In fact, he wrote a book and he rebranded himself not Son of Sam, but Son of Hope. So if any of you want to go tune in and see a serial killer that's alive, even though he's in prison for life, you can look and certainly see some interviews that David Berkowitz may have given in more recent years. But the other one that is really one that is fascinating, and I talked about it not too long ago when I talked about Signature, is Richard Ramirez, aka the Night Stalker. And what he would do is, again, make them swear to Satan. There's videos out there where he talks about this elusive, dark, demonic force, but he's felt that force, and it's been the reason why he has killed and would kill again. And so that is the visionary subtype. And again, they would have to swear allegiance to the devil before he assaults them and would kill them. And if you certainly want to look at a very good documentary, this is nothing more than a plug. And I don't even want to call it a plug, because there's a lot of things out there about Richard Ramirez. But Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer, is a video you can certainly go watch on some of your favorite social media streaming services. So, as I get ready to close and get ready to wrap this up, and thank you for indulging me on this long lecture again. Normally, the lectures will be broken into 2 parts, so you to kind of whet your appetite, you get your part 1, and then I come back with part 2. Ideally, once I kind of get my bearings straight with the recording, and the last couple of weeks have been a little bit all over the place, but we're getting there. Ideally, lectures will release on Wednesdays, and then they will also release on Fridays. So you will get the lecture literally the day after I lecture in real time. Again, this is what CJC, Criminal Justice College, with Professor for the People is all about. So our last categorization is the Angel of Death. And this is a serial killer who claims to kill out of sympathy, but they feel like they're doing this due to deep feelings of inadequacy, or what they feel is a lack of recognition for their talents. Now let me stop there. Each one of us has a unique talent. You may be a skilled athlete, you could be a skilled orator, you could be a skilled public service worker, you could be a skilled teacher, you could be a skilled anything, a skilled author. There's always this feeling that we're not recognized for our talents. And that's a hard place to be. That's a very difficult place to be. And I'm just gonna say it from a practical standpoint. Generally speaking, when people feel like they are not being recognized for their talents, they respond. Well, how do you respond? Do you respond out of anger? Do you respond out of frustration? Do you respond out of love? Do you respond out of, taking matters into your own hands? Like, everybody has a different way in which they respond. And so when looking at the Angel of Death categorization of a serial killer, they may be emotionally unstable, and they might even be narcissistic because they feel like nobody recognizes my talents. But if I can just get people to look at me, if I can just get people to see that I am a skilled writer, I am a skilled teacher, I am a skilled orator, then they'll recognize me, and I'll get the accolades and the adulation that I feel that I deserve. And so with this example, there was a nurse, Janine Jones. She would bring infants to the brink of death and then attempt to resuscitate them for praise. In other words, oh my goodness, this infant's dying. And I got it. And then whatever nurses do to try to resuscitate them, bring them back to life, pull them from the brink of death, and people would say, she's a hero. She was a villain. She was a horrible individual, because look what happened. Several babies died. And then the reason why she fits the serial killer categorization is simply because she would do this over a period of time and then cool off and then come back and do it. Because if she did it more often and more frequently, people would say something's going on here. And eventually she was caught. But this is a strong example of an angel of death. They're bringing death, but they're doing so under the guise that they're helping to bring forth life. And our last thing are collectors. Now, I'm going to give you a little sneak peek. I love scary movies, right? I love scary movies. You know, I have posters around the walls here of some scary movies. And, you know, I'll shift gears and, you know, you may see some in the back and some background of some of my videos. But the collector is a serial killer who prefers to keep the victims alive long term, but they will often kill them due to complications or if the victim refuses to cooperate. So two notable collectors were guys by the name of Gary Heidnik and Todd Kohlhepp. What they did was they had victims that they would torture, and some of the victims they would kill immediately. Others they tried to hold on and torture for a long period of time because they enjoyed the torture, and then eventually they would let them go. Or they would kill them, rather. They wouldn't let them go because they didn't want to get caught. They would kill them. And one notable collector that we could argue was Dennis Rader, because his mantra was bind, torture, kill. Now, Dennis Rader was not known to keep people alive for a long period of time, but if Dennis Rader had kept his victims alive for a long period of time, he would absolutely be labeled as a collector. Basically, collectors are these psychotic individuals who want to keep victims, keep them locked up, torture them. Some they'll kill, others they'll kind of drag it out until they do kill them, but they're collecting them for a purpose of satisfying this need, this desire, this craving to murder. So, what I want to do is I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Just a quick summary is that we looked at psychopaths and sociopaths. What are the differences between the two? Then we talked about the modus operandi of a killer and their signature. What's the common definition of a serial killer and how it originated from the FBI? Again, tune into my next video, which would technically be a sequel to this, but we'll see how with the FBI, the definition of a serial killer is it's a criminal, it's a somewhat fluid definition, but it does change, but it's not clinical, and we are going to see what clinical specialists would argue and what they would categorize, how they would categorize someone who maybe has some violent tendencies. Again, we will get into that in the next video. Then we looked at the categorical types of serial killers. They're organized or disorganized, and then looked at all the different subtypes: angry and power controlling, visionary, psychotic, all of these to ideological, to name a few. And then of course overkill was also reviewed, as well as those other potential categorizations, which includes angels of death and collectors. So I want you to, again, if you haven't subscribed, be sure to subscribe. If you watch this lecture from the beginning to end and you're like, you know what, I can dig him. I see why he's being known as Professor for the People. I am a professor that's going to present it for you. I am a professor that is going to take great pride in lecturing and giving full energy and, just being as engaging as I possibly can, hoping that you'll sit back and say, man, I really learned something. Wow. I want to hear more of what he's going to talk about in the near future. And this is so fascinating. So that's why if you haven't liked it, please be sure to like, be sure to subscribe. Professor for the People. Share with your friends. Put this out there. Whether you're in Florida or New York or Texas or California or anywhere in between, share it with people. Share it with your parents. Your parents might be fascinated by this as well. Again, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for your love. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see you next time.